Cayton, New York was the kind of town where time seemed to stand still. A place where neighbors knew one another, children played on tree-lined streets, and the air carried a gentle quietness. The Clayton family fit right into this idyllic picture, or so it appeared. Kelley Clayton was the heart of her family. Her laugh was infectious, her energy unmatched, and her dedication to her children, Charlie and Cullen, was unwavering. Every morning she would walk them to the school bus, sharing cheerful goodbyes and promises of homemade cookies after school. To everyone in Cayton, she was the epitome of warmth and love. Her husband, Thomas Clayton, was a figure of admiration, or perhaps envy. A former professional hockey player turned successful businessman, he was the man who seemed to have it all. Their house stood as a symbol of their achievements, spacious, beautifully kept, and surrounded by lush greenery. But behind the polished exterior, cracks had begun to show. That morning, Kelley stood by the kitchen counter, staring at her coffee cup as steam spiraled upward. Her best friend Sarah had stopped by to chat. Kelley's usual vivacity seemed dimmed. "I don't know, Sarah," she began, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Something's been off lately." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Off how?" Kelley hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "Thomas, he's distant, cold, like he's here but not really here, you know?" Sarah leaned closer, her expression serious. "Kelley, you've been feeling this for a while now. Maybe you should trust your gut." Kelley sighed, glancing toward the living room where family photos adorned the walls. "I just keep telling myself it's work stress, but there's this voice in the back of my head saying, there's more to it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Thomas stepped out, carrying his work bag and a box of pastries he had picked up on his way back from an early meeting. He entered the kitchen, greeted Sarah with a curt nod, and placed the box on the counter. "Morning," he said, his tone neutral. Kelley forced a smile. "Thanks for the pastries." Sarah couldn't help but notice the tension in the room. Thomas's eyes didn't linger on Kelley the way they used to, and Kelley seemed to shrink in his presence. As he walked out to take a phone call, Sarah whispered, "You deserve to be happy, Kelley. Don't settle for less." Kelley gave a small nod, though doubt lingered in her eyes. She glanced at the box of pastries, wondering if they were meant to be a peace offering or just another distraction from whatever was pulling her husband away. Later that evening, the family gathered for dinner. Thomas was quiet, answering Kelley's attempts at conversation with one-word responses. Charlie giggled as Cullen spilled his milk, and Kelley seized the moment to lighten the mood. "Careful there, buddy. We'll have to get you a milk-proof cup," she teased. Thomas barely looked up, his focus fixed on his phone. Kelley's smile faltered. She glanced at him, hoping for some acknowledgement of their family's joyful chaos, but his expression remained distant. As the evening wore on, Kelley tucked the children into bed. Charlie, her curious 7-year-old, tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, why is Daddy always on his phone?" Kelley paused, stroking her daughter's hair. "Daddy's just busy, sweetie, but you and Cullen are what's most important, okay?" Charlie nodded, satisfied with her mother's reassurance. Kelley kissed her on the forehead, though her own thoughts swirled with uncertainty. Downstairs, Thomas sat alone in the living room, scrolling through his phone. Kelley hesitated at the doorway, debating whether to bring up her concerns. Instead, she retreated to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. The silence between them felt louder than any argument. As she sat by the kitchen window, watching the moonlight filter through the trees, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Something was coming. She could feel it, but she couldn't yet fathom how much her life was about to change. The next morning brought the crisp air of autumn to Cayton, but inside the Clayton household, a chill lingered that had nothing to do with the weather. Kelley moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, but her mind was heavy with the unease that had taken root the day before. The tension between her and Thomas was becoming harder to ignore. Thomas had left early again, his departure accompanied by a curt, "See you later." Kelley stood at the doorway watching his car disappear down the street, her arms crossed. There was a time when his goodbye kisses were a small but cherished ritual. Now they were distant memories. Mid-morning, Kelley sat at the dining table, flipping through bills and receipts. She paused when her eyes landed on an unfamiliar charge, a boutique in a neighboring town, known for its high-end jewelry. The date on the receipt was last Thursday, the same day Thomas had come home late, claiming he'd had a business meeting. Her fingers trembled as she held the receipt. "Who was this for?" she muttered to herself. Sarah's words from the previous day echoed in her mind. "You deserve to be happy, Kelley. Don't settle for less." The thought of confronting Thomas again weighed on her, but the suspicion was gnawing at her resolve. Determined, she picked up her phone and dialed his number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. "Hey, it's me," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We need to talk tonight." That evening, Kelley waited at the kitchen counter, the receipt folded neatly in her pocket. Thomas arrived, his usual air of detachment firmly in place. "What's for dinner?" he asked, setting his briefcase down without a glance in her direction. Kelley took a deep breath. "Thomas, we need to talk." He paused, looking at her for the first time all evening. "What about?" "This," she said, pulling the receipt from her pocket and placing it on the counter. "What's this about?" Thomas's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the paper. "Are you seriously going through my things now?" "Don't deflect," Kelley shot back, her voice rising. "I want to know why you were at that boutique." "It's not what you think," he replied, his tone sharp. "It was a gift for a client, a business deal." Kelley stared at him, her gut screaming that he was lying. "A gift for a client? Since when do you spend hundreds of dollars on jewelry for work?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Kelley, drop it. You're blowing this out of proportion." "No, I'm not," she said, her voice breaking. "You're not the same, Thomas. Something's wrong. I can feel it." He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the room. "I'm done with this conversation," he muttered over his shoulder. Kelley stood frozen, the tension in her chest suffocating. The man she once trusted implicitly now felt like a stranger. She was left alone in the kitchen, the sound of the front door slamming echoing through the house. Later that night, Kelley sat in bed, her laptop open as she searched for private investigators in the area. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, a small voice in her head urging caution. But her heart, heavy with doubt, pushed her forward. Charlie peeked into the room, rubbing her eyes. "Mommy, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice small and sleepy. Kelley quickly shut her laptop and smiled, masking her turmoil. "Of course, sweetheart. Go back to bed. I'll be in soon." After tucking Charlie back in, Kelley returned to her laptop. This time, she didn't hesitate. She filled out a contact form detailing her suspicions and requesting a discreet consultation. As she hit submit, a sense of finality washed over her. There was no turning back now. In the silence of the house, Kelley lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The man sleeping beside her was still her husband in name, but the warmth and safety she once felt in his presence were long gone. The cracks in their facade were growing wider by the day, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything shattered. The rain began to fall in a steady rhythm as Thomas Clayton pulled his car into the driveway of a modest home on the outskirts of Caton. It wasn't his own house. This was the weekly poker game he attended with friends, a tradition that had become more of an escape than a pastime. As he stepped out, the cool rain mixed with the warmth of the headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cigars and the sound of laughter. A small group of men sat around the poker table, stacks of chips spread across its surface. They greeted Thomas with casual nods as he entered, a man among friends but still guarded, his exterior impenetrable. "Thomas!" one of the men called out, shuffling a deck of cards. "Thought you weren't going to make it tonight." Thomas smirked and shrugged. "Wouldn't miss it." The game started as usual, bets placed, jokes shared, and the occasional burst of frustration as hands were lost. But Thomas wasn't his usual self. He was quieter, his focus divided. He kept glancing at his phone, its screen lighting up intermittently with unread messages. None of the other men seemed to notice or care. They were absorbed in the game. In the middle of the second round, Thomas's phone vibrated again. He glanced down at the screen, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he pushed back his chair and stood up. "Bathroom break," he muttered, slipping his phone into his pocket. As he walked down the hallway, the sound of rain tapping against the windows seemed to echo louder. He ducked into the kitchen instead of the bathroom, checking his phone. A single message awaited him. "It's done." His grip on the phone tightened, his breath quickening for a moment before he shoved it back into his pocket. Thomas returned to the table, his composure intact, his demeanor as neutral as ever. The men barely noticed his absence, engrossed in the game. He sat down, picked up his cards, and forced a grin. Who's ready to lose their chips? Meanwhile, miles away, the Clayton house stood silent, except for the faint creak of footsteps on the wooden floor. Kelley was already in bed, but she hadn't fallen asleep yet. The sound of the rain was soothing, a lullaby she welcomed after a long day. She had tucked the children in hours ago, kissed their foreheads, and reassured Charlie that everything would be fine. But everything wasn't fine. In the shadows outside, Michael Beard stood motionless, rain dripping from his hood. The text message on his phone glowed faintly in the darkness. "Make it quick." He exhaled deeply, his breath fogging in the cool night air before he moved toward the house. Back at the poker game, the evening carried on as though nothing were amiss. Thomas's laugh punctuated the chatter, blending seamlessly with the other men's. To anyone watching, he was just another husband out for a night with the guys. Yet, beneath the surface, his mind was somewhere else entirely, thinking of what was unfolding back home. By the time the game ended, Thomas was the last to leave. He lingered, talking casually with the host, thanking him for a great night. His alibi was perfectly in place, every detail meticulously planned. The host laughed as he walked Thomas to the door. "Hey, you played it smart tonight. Didn't lose as much as last week," Thomas chuckled. "Gotta keep you guessing." Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the ground slick with puddles. Thomas climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. He didn't drive straight home. Instead, he took a longer route, his mind racing with thoughts of what awaited him. As he approached his house, he saw no signs of disturbance. No police cars, no lights flashing, just silence. Thomas stepped out of the car, pausing to take a breath before opening the front door. Inside, the stillness was unnerving. He called out Kelley's name, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. There was no response. He climbed the stairs, his footsteps cautious. When he reached the master bedroom, his breath caught. The sight before him was exactly what he had expected and feared. He dialed 911, his voice calm yet strained. "I just got home, and my wife is on the floor. She's not breathing." The house was still. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain against the windows were the only sounds breaking the silence. Kelley had just finished tucking in her children. Charlie, ever curious, had asked why their dad wasn't home yet. Kelley reassured her, hiding the unease that had been growing inside her all evening. "It's just poker night, sweetie," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Go to sleep. I'll be right downstairs." Downstairs, Kelley settled onto the couch, wrapping a blanket around herself. The weight of the last few days pressed down on her. The confrontation with Thomas, the receipt, his evasive behavior, it all pointed to something she didn't want to admit. But there wasn't time to dwell. Her children needed her strength, and for now, that would have to be enough. Outside, Michael Beard stood beneath the shadow of a large tree, his breath visible in the cold night air. The message on his phone glowed faintly in his hand. "Make it quick." He glanced toward the darkened house, his jaw tightening. This wasn't supposed to be personal, just a job. But the sight of the home, so ordinary and warm, gave him pause. For a moment, he considered turning back. Then he remembered the money and the promise of a fresh start. As Beard approached the house, the soft crunch of gravel under his boots was swallowed by the rain. He reached the side door, testing the handle. Unlocked, just as planned. The door creaked open and he slipped inside. Kelley stirred on the couch, sensing something. She sat up, scanning the room. "Thomas?" she called out, her voice tentative. No answer. She stood, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself as she moved toward the kitchen. The overhead light flickered, casting shadows across the room. Then she heard it. A faint rustle, the sound of movement, where there shouldn't be any. Her heart quickened. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound firm. Silence. She reached for her phone on the counter, but before she could grab it, a figure emerged from the shadows. Beard stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. Kelley froze, the weight of his presence pinning her in place. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. Her children, she had to protect them. "Take whatever you want," she said, her voice trembling. "Just don't hurt my kids." Beard didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his intentions clear. Kelley grabbed a glass from the counter and hurled it toward him, shattering it against the wall. The sound was deafening in the silence of the house. Upstairs, Charlie stirred, the noise pulling her from sleep. She slipped out of bed, her tiny feet padding across the floor as she peeked down the staircase. From her vantage point, she could see her mother, standing defiant, and the man advancing toward her. Kelley lunged for a knife from the block on the counter, but Beard was faster. He grabbed her arm, twisting it, and the knife clattered to the floor. She fought with everything she had, kicking, scratching, screaming, but he was stronger. The struggle moved into the living room, where Kelley managed to break free for a moment. She turned toward the stairs, her only thought to get to her children. "Charlie!" she screamed, her voice filled with desperation. "Stay upstairs! Lock the door!" Charlie froze, her heart pounding. She wanted to run to her mother, to help her, but fear kept her rooted in place. The fight ended as suddenly as it began. Kelley's cries were silenced, and the house fell into an eerie quiet. Beard stood over her motionless body, his breathing heavy. For a moment he hesitated, looking at what he had done. Then he wiped his hands on his jacket, turned, and slipped out the same way he came. Charlie crept down the stairs, her small frame trembling. She found her mother lying on the floor, her once vibrant presence now still. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Mommy, wake up." The early morning light seeped through the curtains of the Clayton house, casting long, eerie shadows across the living room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint whimper of Charlie as she sat at the base of the staircase, clutching her knees. Her wide, tear-filled eyes remained fixed on her mother's still body. It was nearly 6 a.m. when Thomas pulled into the driveway. The rumble of his car engine pierced the quiet morning, startling Charlie. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her face, unsure whether to run or hide. As the door creaked open, Thomas stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Charlie?" he called out, his voice cutting through the thick tension. He took a step into the living room and froze. His wife lay motionless on the floor, her lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. The coffee table was overturned, shards of broken glass scattered across the carpet. Kelley's robe was stained dark, the fabric twisted unnaturally around her torso. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air. "What the?" Thomas whispered, dropping his keys. His voice rose in urgency. "Kelley? Kelley!" Charlie peeked around the corner, her small voice trembling. "Daddy, Mommy won't wake up." Thomas turned to see his daughter standing there, her face pale and streaked with tears. He quickly crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay, I'm here," he murmured, though his own breathing betrayed his panic. Grabbing his phone, Thomas dialed 911. His voice, calm yet strained, sent chills through the dispatcher. "My wife, she's not breathing. I just got home and found her on the floor." The operator began asking routine questions, but Thomas's responses were clipped and mechanical, almost rehearsed. "No, I don't know what happened," he said. "It looks like someone broke in." As emergency responders arrived, the scene quickly shifted into chaos. Police officers cordoned off the house, directing Thomas and Charlie to sit outside while paramedics examined Kelley. The lead investigator, Detective Reynolds, entered the home with a sharp eye for detail. It didn't take long for him to notice inconsistencies. "No signs of forced entry," Reynolds muttered, pointing at the unbroken locks on the doors and windows. "And the living room? It's a mess, but nothing's missing. Jewelry, electronics, all untouched." He turned toward the paramedics who were now carefully moving Kelley's body. One of them shook his head subtly, confirming what everyone feared. She was gone. Reynolds approached Thomas, who sat on the front steps with Charlie huddled beside him. "Mr. Clayton, I'm sorry for your loss," he began, his voice steady. "But I need to ask you some questions." Thomas nodded, his face a mask of sorrow. "Of course," he said quietly. "Where were you last night?" "I was at a poker game," Thomas replied, his tone neutral. "With friends. I got home early this morning and found her like this." "Do you have anyone who can confirm that?" "Yes," Thomas said, meeting the detective's gaze. "Everyone at the game can vouch for me." Reynolds scribbled in his notebook, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And did your wife mention anything unusual recently? Anyone she was worried about?" Thomas hesitated, glancing at Charlie, who stared blankly at the ground. "No," he finally said. "Everything was normal." Reynolds didn't press further, but suspicion gnawed at the edges of his mind. Something wasn't adding up. Inside the house, a crime scene technician found a small, muddy footprint near the back door. "Detective, over here," she called. "This looks fresh." Reynolds crouched down, inspecting the print. "Interesting," he murmured. He straightened, his mind already spinning. "Bag it. Let's see if we can get anything off it." As the hours dragged on, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Kelley Clayton, the lively mother and friend everyone adored, was gone. The thought was unbearable, and the questions surrounding her death were multiplying. By the time the police wrapped up their initial investigation, Thomas was left standing alone in the driveway. Charlie had been taken to stay with a family friend, away from the chaos. He watched as the last patrol car pulled away, his expression unreadable. Inside the house, the faint scent of rain lingered, mingling with the heavier, darker memories that would never wash away. Detective Reynolds sat at his desk, the faint hum of fluorescent lights filling the room. The Clayton case had consumed him since the early hours of the morning. Kelley's death was tragic enough, but the inconsistencies in Thomas's account gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. There were too many unanswered questions. He flipped through the initial report again, pausing on the detail about the footprint near the back door. No forced entry, no missing valuables, Reynolds muttered. But this print, it doesn't belong here. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Daniels entered, a folder in hand. "Sir, we've got something. A neighbor's security camera picked up a car near the Clayton house late last night." Reynolds perked up. "License plate?" Daniels shook his head. "No clear shot, but it's a dark sedan. Matches the description of a vehicle registered to Michael Beard." The name made Reynolds sit up straighter. Beard, a former employee of Thomas Clayton, had been fired from the restoration company months earlier. "Why would Beard be anywhere near the Clayton house?" Reynolds mused. Daniels hesitated. "There's more. Beard's known to have financial troubles. Gambling debts, overdue rent. He might have been desperate." Reynolds leaned back, piecing the puzzle together. "Let's bring him in, see what he has to say." Meanwhile, across town, Thomas was pacing in his living room. His phone buzzed, another text from one of his poker buddies offering condolences. The messages were relentless, each one feeling like a needle in his skin. He poured himself a drink, his hand shaking slightly as he brought the glass to his lips. The front door swung open and Sarah entered, her expression tight. "Thomas," she began, her voice low but firm. "I need to talk to you." Thomas turned, his face darkening. "This isn't a good time, Sarah." She ignored him, stepping closer. "I was with Kelley the day before this happened. She told me things about you." Thomas's jaw clenched. "What are you talking about?" "She said you've been distant, cold, that she found receipts for things that didn't add up. Jewelry, expensive dinners." "Who were they for, Thomas?" He slammed his glass onto the counter, the sound sharp and jarring. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Sarah shot back, her eyes narrowing. "The police are going to dig, Thomas. They're going to find everything. If there's something you're hiding, now's the time to come clean." Thomas didn't respond, his silence more damning than any admission. Sarah stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking out, leaving the air between them thick with unspoken accusations. Back at the station, Beard sat across from Reynolds, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said for the third time. "Michael," Reynolds said, leaning forward, his voice calm but sharp, "your car was seen near the Clayton house. You've got debts piling up, no job. It's not looking good for you." Beard's eyes darted around the room, sweat beading on his forehead. "I didn't do anything, I swear." Reynolds placed a photo of Kelley on the table, her smiling face staring back at them. "That's Kelley Clayton, a mother, a wife, someone who didn't deserve this. If you know something, now's the time to talk." Beard hesitated, his lips trembling. Then quietly he said, "I didn't want to hurt her." Reynolds' heart pounded. "But you did. Why?" Beard looked down at his hands, his voice barely audible. "Thomas, he asked me to do it. Said he'd pay me 10 grand. I needed the money." The confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. Reynolds leaned back, his mind racing. "Thomas Clayton hired you to kill his wife?" Beard nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't have a choice. He made it sound like it was the only way." Reynolds stood, his jaw tight. "Daniels," he called out, "place this man under arrest and get me a warrant for Thomas Clayton." As Beard was led away in handcuffs, Reynolds stared at the photo of Kelley on the table. Her death had been senseless, cruel, and calculated. And now, the man who was supposed to protect her was at the center of it all. Detective Reynolds stood in the interrogation room, the air heavy with tension. Across the table, Michael Beard sat with his hands cuffed, his head bowed. The initial confession he had given had cracked open the case, but Reynolds needed more. Details, clarity, a complete picture. "Michael," Reynolds began, his voice measured, "you've already admitted Thomas Clayton hired you, but I need the truth, every piece of it." Beard looked up, his eyes rimmed red, the weight of guilt visible on his face. "I didn't want to do it," he said quietly, but he wouldn't let up. He made it sound like there was no other way. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Beard took a shaky breath. "It started a few months ago. I was out of work, bills piling up. I couldn't see a way out. Then Thomas called me out of the blue, said he had a job for me." "What kind of job?" Reynolds pressed. Beard's hands trembled as he recounted the conversation. At first, he said it was just to scare her, said Kelley was causing him problems and he needed her out of the way. I thought maybe it was about divorce, custody. I didn't know. But then he made it clear. He wanted her gone. Reynolds' jaw tightened. And you agreed? I was desperate, Beard admitted, tears welling in his eyes. He promised 10 grand, enough to pay off my debts and start over. He said it would be quick, clean. No one would ever know. Did he give you instructions? Reynolds asked, his tone relentless. Beard nodded. He told me to wait until he was out at his poker game, said the door would be unlocked. He even gave me her schedule, when she'd be home alone, when the kids would be in bed. The detective's stomach churned. The level of calculation, the coldness, it was more than he had anticipated. What happened that night? Reynolds demanded. Beard hesitated, his voice breaking. I went to the house, like he said. I thought maybe I could back out, but when I got there, I froze. Then I saw her sitting on the couch. She saw me and she started screaming. I panicked. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Reynolds' voice dropped. But you did it. Beard nodded, his face crumpling. She fought so hard, I didn't expect that. She kept saying, my kids, please don't hurt my kids. But I wasn't thinking straight. I just wanted it to be over. The room fell silent, the gravity of Beard's words hanging heavily in the air. Reynolds stepped back, his face a mask of controlled fury. And after? What did you do? I ran, Beard said. Got back in my car and drove. I texted him, told him it was done. Reynolds pulled a photo from his file, slamming it onto the table. It was a screenshot of the text conversation between Beard and Thomas. This? This is what you sent him? Beard nodded, his hands trembling. Yeah. He didn't reply right away. But when he did, all he said was, good. Like it was nothing. Reynolds stared at the man across from him, a mix of anger and disgust boiling inside. Do you have any proof? Anything that ties him to this? Beard hesitated, then slowly he said, there's a voice memo. He sent it to me, telling me what to do. I didn't delete it. Reynolds felt a surge of adrenaline. Where is it? My phone, Beard said. It's in evidence now. Check it. Reynolds turned, barking orders at the officers outside. Get that phone. Now. As Beard was led away, Reynolds stood alone in the interrogation room, the weight of the confession pressing down on him. The voice memo could be the smoking gun they needed, solidifying Thomas's role as the mastermind behind Kelley's murder. Back in his office, Reynolds played the voice memo for the first time. Thomas's voice came through calm and calculated. You know what to do. Don't mess this up. The detective clenched his fists. The evidence was damning. But as he stared at Kelley's photo on his desk, he knew the fight was far from over. Thomas Clayton had built an airtight alibi, and dismantling it would be a battle unlike any other. The conference room was sterile and quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock mounted on the wall. Detective Reynolds stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed, as a young woman sat nervously across from him. Her name was Vanessa, and she was the woman Thomas Clayton had been seeing behind Kelley's back. Reynolds observed her carefully. Her polished appearance, immaculate hair, tailored blazer, couldn't hide the tension in her posture or the flicker of unease in her eyes. She was here willingly, but Reynolds could tell she wasn't eager to speak. Vanessa, he began, his tone even but firm. You understand why we called you in, right? She nodded, avoiding his gaze. You think I know something about Kelley's death. Do you? Reynolds asked, leaning forward slightly. Because if you do, now is the time to tell the truth. We already know about your relationship with Thomas. Her head snapped up, her face a mix of surprise and fear. He told you? Reynolds gave a small shake of his head. No, Vanessa, we found out. And if we found out, you can bet the jury will too. So I'm giving you a chance to explain your side of the story. Vanessa hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. I didn't know he was married, not at first. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. But you found out. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me a few months in. He said his marriage was over, that they were only staying together for the kids. Did you believe him? She shrugged helplessly. I wanted to. Reynolds allowed a moment of silence to hang between them before pressing on. Vanessa, when was the last time you spoke to Thomas? She hesitated again, but finally said, the day before Kelley died. The admission hit the room like a thunderclap. Reynolds straightened. What did you talk about? Vanessa's hands trembled. He said things would be different soon, that he'd finally be free to live the life he wanted. Reynolds' expression darkened. Did he say how? No, Vanessa said quickly, but he sounded so sure, like he already had a plan. The detective's gut twisted. He knew Vanessa's testimony could be pivotal, but he needed more. Did he ever mention hiring someone, maybe to help him with his plan? Vanessa's eyes widened and she shook her head. No, I swear I didn't know anything about that. Reynolds studied her, weighing the truth of her words. Vanessa, did he ever say anything that might suggest he was capable of something like this? Anything at all? For a moment she didn't answer. Then reluctantly she said, there was one time. He joked about how much easier life would be without Kelley. He laughed, but the way he said it, it scared me. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Reynolds asked, his voice sharp. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. Because I didn't think he meant it, and now she's gone, and I don't know if I could have stopped it. Reynolds softened, sensing her genuine remorse. Vanessa, I need you to write all of this down. Every detail. This could be the key to putting Thomas where he belongs. As Vanessa began to write, Reynolds stepped out of the room. Outside, Officer Daniels waited with a file in hand. Detective, Daniels said, his tone urgent. The voice memo from Beard's phone. It corroborates everything she just said. Thomas's voice is clear as day. Reynolds exhaled slowly, a grim sense of satisfaction washing over him. Good. Get this all into evidence. We're building a case he won't walk away from. Inside the conference room, Vanessa finished her statement, her face pale but determined. She handed the paper to Reynolds as he re-entered. Will this help? She asked, her voice small. Reynolds looked her in the eye. More than you know. As Vanessa was escorted out, Reynolds sat down, reviewing her statement. The pieces were falling into place, each more damning than the last. Thomas Clayton had spun a web of lies, but it was unraveling faster than he could contain it. Detective Reynolds sat in the poker room of Thomas Clayton's friend Mark, studying the worn cards and empty chairs. The room smelled faintly of smoke and spilled beer, remnants of the game Thomas had used as his alibi. But Reynolds wasn't here to admire the setup. He was here to tear Thomas's story apart. Mark, Reynolds began, leaning back in his chair, let's go over the timeline again. What time did Thomas arrive that night? Mark fidgeted with his drink, avoiding eye contact. Around 7, I think, same as always. And he stayed the whole time? Reynolds pressed, his tone deceptively casual. Mark hesitated, his face betraying the cracks in his composure. Yeah, mostly. Mostly? Reynolds pounced on the word. What do you mean by mostly? Well, Mark scratched the back of his neck, glancing at the other men in the room. He stepped out for a bit, said he needed to take a call. Reynolds's pen hovered over his notebook. How long was he gone? Mark shrugged, his discomfort palpable. I don't know. 15, 20 minutes maybe? Another player, Rick, chimed in, his voice quieter but firmer. It was longer than that. I remember looking at the clock. He was gone close to 40 minutes. Reynolds's heart quickened. This was the hole he needed. Did anyone ask where he went? Rick nodded. He said he had to call a client, something about an emergency. Reynolds scribbled down the details, his mind racing. And did he seem off to you? Nervous? Distracted? Mark and Rick exchanged glances before Mark spoke. I mean, he didn't say much when he got back, just jumped back into the game like nothing happened. But yeah, now that you mention it, he wasn't himself. Back at the station, Reynolds pieced together the damning timeline. Thomas had left the game long enough to coordinate with Michael Beard and ensure everything was on track. His alibi, carefully constructed, was beginning to crumble. Later that day, Thomas was brought in for questioning. He sat across from Reynolds, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas, Reynolds began, his voice calm but sharp, I need you to explain why your friends say you left the poker game for almost an hour. Thomas's eyes narrowed. I told you, I had to make a call. A call? Reynolds repeated, feigning confusion. Funny, because no one remembers hearing you mention an emergency. They just remember you disappearing. Thomas's fists clenched. This is ridiculous. You're trying to twist everything. Reynolds leaned forward, his tone turning icy. What's ridiculous is how you thought you could outsmart us. We know about the text to Beard. We know you coordinated with him that night. Your alibi is falling apart, Thomas. Thomas glared at Reynolds, his expression dark. You don't have anything on me. Reynolds smirked, pulling a folder from the table and sliding it across. Inside were the transcripts of Beard's confession, the voice memo, and the statements from Vanessa and the poker players. This, Reynolds said, his voice low and cutting, is more than enough. Thomas's face paled as he flipped through the pages. His confident demeanor cracked, and for the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. "You think you can pin this on me?" he snarled, but his voice wavered. "We don't think, Thomas. We know," Reynolds said firmly, his gaze piercing. "And so will the jury." As Thomas was escorted back to his holding cell, Reynolds felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The walls were closing in, and Thomas had nowhere left to run. But Reynolds also knew the fight wasn't over. The courtroom would be the final battleground, and every detail would matter. Outside, the rain began to fall again, a steady rhythm against the windows of the precinct. Reynolds stood at his desk, staring at Kelley's smiling photo. "We're getting closer," he murmured, "closer to justice." The courtroom was a symphony of tension. Rows of wooden benches were filled with friends, family, and townsfolk, their faces etched with curiosity and dread. At the center of it all sat Thomas Clayton, his once confident demeanor reduced to a stoic mask. He was flanked by his defense team, their faces betraying the pressure of the mountain of evidence stacked against their client. On the prosecution side, Detective Reynolds sat quietly, his eyes scanning the room. This trial was the culmination of weeks of relentless investigation, sleepless nights, and a determination to bring Kelley the justice she deserved. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Judge Miller entered, her robe flowing as she took her seat. The trial had officially begun. The prosecutor, a sharp and deliberate woman named Evelyn Hart, stood to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and commanding, "this is a case of betrayal, greed, and cold-blooded calculation. Thomas Clayton, the man who was supposed to love and protect his wife, orchestrated her murder for his own selfish gain." Evelyn paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "We will show you evidence, texts, voice recordings, and witness testimony that will leave no doubt in your mind. Thomas Clayton did not just commit this crime, he planned it." Thomas's lawyer, Robert Grant, countered with calm confidence. "This is a tragedy," he began, pacing slowly, "but the prosecution's case is built on assumptions and coerced confessions. My client is innocent, and by the end of this trial, you will see that this so-called evidence is nothing but circumstantial." The first witness called to the stand was Michael Beard. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his eyes avoided the piercing gazes of the jury. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Mr. Beard," she began, "did Thomas Clayton hire you to kill his wife?" Beard hesitated, glancing briefly at Thomas before nodding. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "And what exactly did he ask you to do?" He said he needed her gone. He told me when to go, how to get in, and what to do." Evelyn leaned closer. "Did he pay you for this?" Beard nodded again. $10,000. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and Judge Miller's gavel struck sharply. "Order in the court." When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, Grant pounced. "Mr. Beard, you're a convicted felon, aren't you?" "Yes," Beard admitted. "And isn't it true that you're saying all of this to reduce your own sentence?" Beard's jaw tightened. "I'm telling the truth." Grant's smirk was barely concealed. "Of course you are," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Next, Vanessa took the stand. She appeared composed, but the strain was visible in her posture. As she recounted her last conversation with Thomas, the courtroom hung on her every word. "He said things would be different soon," she repeated, her voice trembling. "That he'd finally be free." The defense attempted to discredit her, painting her as a spurned lover seeking revenge. But Vanessa held her ground, her testimony unwavering. Finally, Evelyn played the voice memo found on Beard's phone. Thomas's voice filled the courtroom, calm, deliberate, and chillingly clear. "You know what to do, don't mess this up." The jury shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying their reactions. For the first time, Thomas's composure cracked. He leaned toward Grant, whispering furiously. Reynolds observed it all, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The evidence was damning, the witnesses credible. But he knew the trial was far from over. The defense still had cards to play, and the jury's decision would ultimately come down to more than just the facts. It would come down to what they believed. As court adjourned for the day, the buzz of conversation filled the room. Friends and family of Kelley exchanged glances of hope and determination. The fight for justice was nearing its climax, and the stakes had never been higher. Thomas walked out of the courtroom, his face pale, his steps heavier than when he entered. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the next witness was called. An older man with a rugged demeanor stepped forward. He was introduced as Greg Sanders, a former employee at the restoration company owned by Thomas Clayton. Greg had worked under Thomas for years before leaving under mysterious circumstances. Detective Reynolds, seated near the prosecutor's table, leaned forward. Greg's name hadn't surfaced during the investigation until now. What secrets did this man hold? The jury watched intently as Greg raised his hand to swear the oath. The prosecutor, Evelyn Hart, began her questioning. "Mr. Sanders, how long did you work for Thomas Clayton?" "About 8 years," Greg replied, his voice gravelly but steady. "And why did you leave the company?" Greg hesitated, glancing briefly at Thomas, who sat motionless at the defense table. "Let's just say, working for Thomas wasn't exactly easy. He liked things done his way, and if you didn't fall in line, you didn't last long." Evelyn nodded, allowing the jury to absorb his words. "Mr. Sanders, during your time working for Mr. Clayton, did he ever discuss unconventional ways of solving his problems?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. "Yeah," he admitted. "He'd make these offhand comments, jokes mostly, but they always had this edge to them." "Can you give us an example?" Evelyn pressed. Greg sighed deeply, his eyes darting to the jury. "There was one time, a supplier messed up an order. Thomas was furious. He said, 'People like that don't deserve to live. Maybe I should hire someone to take care of him.' Everyone laughed it off, but the way he said it didn't sit right with me." The prosecutor's expression sharpened. "And did he ever make similar comments about his wife, Kelley?" Greg hesitated, and the room held its breath. "Yes," he finally said, his voice heavy. "Not often, but once, he said, 'If it weren't for Kelley and the kids, my life would be so much simpler.' He laughed after, but it didn't feel like a joke." The jury exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. The courtroom's atmosphere grew thicker with each revelation. When the defense took the floor, Thomas's lawyer, Robert Grant, approached Greg with a confident stride. "Mr. Sanders," he began, "you left Mr. Clayton's company on bad terms, didn't you?" "Depends on who you ask," Greg replied evenly. Grant smirked. "So would it be fair to say you might have an axe to grind against my client?" "I don't care enough about Thomas to hold a grudge," Greg shot back. "But I care about the truth." Grant's smirk faltered slightly. "And you're telling us these jokes are evidence of intent? Isn't it possible you misunderstood?" Greg met his gaze without flinching. "You weren't there. I was." Evelyn rose for redirect. "Mr. Sanders, do you believe Thomas Clayton is capable of following through on these so-called jokes?" Greg's voice was firm. "Yes. After hearing what happened to Kelley, I have no doubt." As Greg stepped down, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The defense's strategy of discrediting witnesses was faltering, and the prosecution's case grew stronger with every testimony. But what happened next turned the trial on its head. During a recess, Evelyn approached Reynolds with a new piece of evidence. "We just got this," she said, handing him a document. "It's from Thomas's financial records." Reynolds scanned the page, his eyes narrowing. "Another life insurance policy?" "Exactly," Evelyn confirmed. "One he took out 6 months before Kelley's death. It's worth twice as much as the first." Back in court, Evelyn presented the policy to the jury, connecting the dots between Thomas's financial struggles and his motive. The revelation was devastating. Thomas's carefully constructed facade was crumbling faster than ever. As court adjourned for the day, Reynolds watched Thomas being led out. For the first time, his expression betrayed him. Fear, anger, and the realization that his lies were catching up with him. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in, their faces solemn. The weight of the case had pressed heavily on everyone present, but for the 12 jurors, it was an unparalleled burden. The fate of Thomas Clayton now rested in their hands. Thomas sat rigid at the defense table, his expression unreadable, but his jaw clenched tightly. To his left, his attorney Robert Grant whispered something in his ear, but Thomas didn't respond. Across the room, Kelley's family huddled together, their hands clasped tightly, their faces etched with a mix of hope and dread. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The judge entered, her presence commanding yet calm. She glanced at the jury foreman who held a folded piece of paper in his hands. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood, his voice steady but low. "We have, Your Honor." Thomas's breath hitched, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Kelley's mother closed her eyes, whispering a prayer under her breath. The tension in the room was unbearable. In the case of the people versus Thomas Clayton, the foreman began, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Kelley's family burst into tears, hugging one another tightly as relief and sorrow mingled on their faces. Thomas sat motionless, his face pale, his eyes staring blankly ahead. His carefully constructed world had just come crashing down. Judge Miller waited for the murmurs to subside before addressing the courtroom. Mr. Clayton, you have been found guilty of the premeditated murder of Kelley Clayton. This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck, and the sound reverberated through the room like the final note of a somber symphony. Kelley's family stepped forward to give their victim impact statements. Her sister Jenna approached the podium, her voice trembling but strong. Kelley was more than a wife and a mother, Jenna said, tears streaming down her face. She was the light in every room she walked into, and now, because of you, Thomas, her children will grow up without their mother. We will never forgive you for taking her from us. Thomas remained stoic, his face betraying no emotion. But when Charlie, his young daughter, was carried forward to speak, a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps regret, crossed his face. Charlie clutched a piece of paper in her small hands, her voice wavering as she read, "My mommy loved me and Cullen. She always said we were her everything. I don't understand why Daddy did this, but I miss her so much." Her innocent words broke the hearts of everyone in the room, and even hardened jurors wiped away tears. After the statements concluded, Thomas was led away in handcuffs. As he passed Kelley's family, he turned briefly toward them, his lips parting as if to speak. But no words came. He was escorted out, the heavy sound of the doors closing behind him marking the end of his life as a free man. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, and the sun peeked through the clouds. Kelley's family gathered on the steps, their faces reflecting a bittersweet mix of grief and relief. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Kelley back. Detective Reynolds stood nearby, watching the family embrace. His work on the case was done, but the emotional toll lingered. He pulled Kelley's photo from his pocket, staring at her smiling face. "You got your justice," he murmured before tucking the photo away. As the crowd dispersed, one thought lingered in everyone's minds: the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences when it's betrayed. Kelley's story would remain a haunting reminder of how greed and deceit could destroy even the strongest bonds. The weeks following the verdict brought a strange sense of quiet to Clayton. The Clayton house, once filled with laughter and life, now stood as a solemn reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The blinds remained drawn, the yard untended. It was no longer a home, just a structure weighed down by memories. Kelley's family took in Charlie and Cullen, determined to shield them from the chaos that still rippled through the town. Jenna, Kelley's sister, had stepped up as their primary caregiver. Despite her grief, she poured her energy into creating a sense of normalcy for the children. One sunny afternoon, Jenna found Charlie sitting alone on the porch swing, clutching a framed photo of Kelley. The girl's face was somber, her eyes distant. Jenna approached gently, sitting beside her. "Do you want to talk about it, sweetie?" Jenna asked softly. Charlie shrugged, her small fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "I miss Mommy," she said quietly. "She always knew how to make me feel better." Jenna placed an arm around her, pulling her close. "I know, honey, I miss her too. But you're so much like her, you know? Brave, kind, always thinking of others." Charlie looked up, her lips trembling. "Do you think she's proud of me?" Jenna's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Oh, Charlie, she's so proud of you. I know she's watching over you and Cullen every single day." At school, Charlie and Cullen struggled to adjust. Whispers followed them in the hallways, and curious glances made every step feel heavier. Their teachers, aware of the children's fragile state, worked to create a supportive environment. Slowly, the kids began to find their footing, forming new friendships and regaining pieces of their childhood. Meanwhile, Detective Reynolds worked quietly behind the scenes, wrapping up loose ends on the case. He visited Kelley's grave one crisp autumn morning, standing silently as the wind rustled the leaves. He placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the headstone, his expression somber. "You deserve better," he murmured, his voice carried away by the breeze. "I'm sorry we couldn't save you, but I hope this brings some peace to your family." In the heart of Clayton, Kelley's friends organized a memorial event in her honor. The town came together, filling the community center with photos, candles, and heartfelt tributes. Each person who stepped up to speak shared stories of Kelley's warmth, her laughter, and the love she brought into every room. As Jenna stood to speak, her voice wavered but didn't falter. "Kelley was more than my sister," she began. "She was my best friend, my rock. Losing her has left a hole in our lives that can never be filled, but I see her every day in Charlie's strength and Cullen's smile. And I know she'd want us to keep going, to love, to laugh, to live." The crowd erupted into applause, tears streaming down many faces. The memorial ended with a candlelight vigil, the soft glow of flames illuminating the dark night as the town honored Kelley's memory. Thomas, now serving his life sentence, sat alone in his cell as news of the memorial reached him. For the first time, the weight of his actions seemed to sink in. The life he had destroyed, the family he had torn apart, it was all on him. But remorse, if it existed, remained buried beneath the layers of his cold, calculated exterior. For Kelley's family, healing was a slow process. There were good days and bad days, moments of laughter mingled with waves of sorrow. But through it all, they held on to one another, finding strength in their shared love for the woman who had been taken too soon. As the sun set over Clayton, the town began to heal. Kelley's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the resilience of the human spirit. Her light, though extinguished, continued to shine through the lives of those who loved her. The sunlight filtered through the trees of Clayton's Central Park as families gathered for the annual fall festival. Children's laughter echoed through the crisp air, a stark contrast to the somber undertones that still lingered in the community. Kelley Clayton's memory was omnipresent, woven into the fabric of the town's collective consciousness. Her tragic story had become more than a tale of betrayal. It was a cautionary narrative, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the consequences of unchecked greed. Jenna, Kelley's sister, stood near a table decorated with photos of Kelley, surrounded by friends and family who had come to support a new initiative in her honor, a fund dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and raising awareness about the warning signs of dangerous relationships. Charlie and Cullen, now a bit older and more resilient, played nearby, their laughter a beacon of hope. As Jenna spoke to the crowd, her voice was filled with a quiet strength. Kelley's life was a testament to love and compassion, but her death was a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist even in the places we feel safest. We cannot let her story be forgotten. It's our responsibility to learn from it, to protect each other, to speak up, and to recognize the signs before it's too late. The crowd nodded in solemn agreement. Among them stood Detective Reynolds, his hands in his pockets, watching the community rally around Kelley's memory. His work on the case had left him with scars, but it had also solidified his resolve. Kelley's death had not been in vain. It had spurred change, ignited conversations, and opened eyes to the realities of hidden abuse. Inside the nearby community center, a support group met for their weekly session. Jenna had started attending shortly after Kelley's death, finding solace among others who had experienced similar losses. Today, she was joined by Vanessa. The once nervous woman had found her voice, channeling her guilt into advocacy and becoming a powerful speaker on the dangers of manipulation and control. "I didn't see it at first," Vanessa said, her voice steady but reflective. "Thomas was charming, confident, and persuasive, but there were always little signs. The way he talked about Kelley, the way he justified his actions. I ignored my instincts, and I'll live with that forever. But if sharing my story can help even one person recognize those red flags, then Kelley's legacy will continue." The group listened intently, their nods and tears a testament to the universality of her words. Jenna reached out, squeezing Vanessa's hand. Together, they were turning pain into purpose, ensuring that Kelley's voice echoed far beyond the walls of the home she had once cherished. Back at the festival, Charlie approached Detective Reynolds, her young face serious beyond her years. "Are you going to catch other bad people like Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. Reynolds crouched to her level, meeting her gaze. "That's the plan," he said, his tone kind but firm. "Your mom would want me to keep helping people." Charlie nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "I think she'd want me to help people too." Reynolds smiled, his chest tightening at her bravery. "She'd be very proud of you, Charlie." As the day turned to evening, the festival concluded with a candlelight vigil for Kelley. Hundreds gathered, their candles glowing softly against the darkening sky. Jenna stood at the front, her arm around Charlie, as the crowd bowed their heads in a moment of silence. In that quiet, the lessons of Kelley's life and death resonated deeply. The importance of listening to instincts, the courage to seek help, and the power of community were etched into the hearts of those present. As the candles flickered, they carried with them not just sorrow, but hope, a commitment to honor Kelley's memory by building a safer, kinder world. Far away in a cold prison cell, Thomas Clayton sat alone. The echoes of the trial, the testimonies, and the verdict reverberated in his mind. He had lost everything, his freedom, his family, and the carefully constructed life he had once controlled. Justice had been served, but for Thomas, it was a hollow conclusion to a story of his own making. For Kelley's family and the town of Clayton, life continued. The road ahead was long, and the pain of loss lingered, but so did the strength of those who survived. Kelley's light, though extinguished, had sparked a movement that would outshine the darkness that took her away. What do you think of Thomas Clayton and the shocking betrayal that led to such a tragic loss? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more gripping true crime stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.